Our webinar is called Is Your Market Data Stack Helping You or Holding You Back? Thanks for joining us here today, wherever you are joining this broadcast from in the world. I'm Matthew DeYoung, Senior Product Manager of Market Data at Barchart. And today I'm joined by my co-host, Mark Water.
Thanks, Matthew. Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Water. I'm the Global Head of Sales for the institutional business here at Barchart. And over the past several years, I've had conversations with all our clients at every stage of their data journey: hedge funds, banks, trading firms, all sorts of market participants. We've learned a great deal from these partners, and we've come prepared to share what has helped them succeed in their data journey. We're glad that you guys could join us for this event.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. And now here on this webinar, there's a good chance that you or someone on your team has actually wrestled with the question that never really seems to go away in financial services. And that is, should we build our own market data infrastructure or should we buy it? Now, for a long time, building felt like an obvious answer to this question. And then APIs gave teams flexibility and control and speed, especially for focused research and symbol level analysis.
Think our session though, on like four very direct questions that brought us here. First, should you build or buy market data infrastructure? That question has been debated for years, and depending on who you ask, the answer changes. Second, has the equation changed over the past 2 to 3 years? Are we still operating under assumptions that made sense in 2018, 2020, but they may not hold true in 2026? And third, was the tipping point really 2025? Did the acceleration of AI, cross-asset strategies, regulatory pressures, and institutional scale create a more structural shift, not just a tactical one? And fourth, is owning all the market data plumbing actually generating a time to value competitive advantage for global financial firms? Or is it quietly becoming a drag on your capital, your engineering team's schedule and speed? You know, is there additional hidden cost in the opportunity cost, if you will? So these are not theoretical questions, they're capital allocation questions for both financial and human capital. They're competitive advantage questions, really. So today our goal is going to give you a practical framework to answer these questions for your own organization. This framework is based on research trends, observations, and what are, most importantly, I guess, really, what our clients are telling us.
Yeah, Mark, in 2025, we really began noticing something consistent across all of our institutional conversations. The search for marketing alpha, it intensified it, and risk management requirements became much more demanding. And we can't forget, the AI initiatives moved from experimentation into production. So these three forces, alpha, risk, and AI, they kind of acted like catalysts. They push firms to take a second look at the build versus buy question. And it's not because APIs stopped working, not at all. And it's not because internal teams lacked any kind of capability. That's not true either. It really was because the scale changed, the complexity changed, the expectations changed. So what used to feel manageable when it came to market data, when it was smaller in scope, it's now starting to feel heavy at kind of an institutional scale. And that's when the question shifted from, can we build this, to should we be building this? And that distinction, although it's subtle, it's strategically very significant, Mark.
I mean, I agree. That's right, Matthew. And over the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen that equation change. But in 2025, it was more than a jump. It was a seismic shift. The search for market alpha, risk management, and AI solutions becomes a catalyst for taking a second look at the build versus buy question, really. As financial firms scale across additional exchanges, asset classes, instruments, teams, and then pile in more intensive regulatory requirements, well, the hidden cost of building that vast technology scaffolding is starting to surface, really. It's not just the engineering costs, but an operational risk, governance gaps, time to value, essentially. Today's session is about that shift, not APIs versus files, not old versus new, but how institutional firms are rethinking where they should build and where they shouldn't anymore.
Yeah, let me talk, Mark, briefly just about what everyone can expect during today's webinar. So here's how we're going to run the broadcast. For the rest of the webinar, we're going to spend time on firstly talking about how market data delivery has evolved over the last few years and how many institutions are kind of quietly rethinking their build strategies. And then we'll walk through what's changed operationally, what's possible now, and how firms are actually deploying enterprise-grade market data in days rather than months or quarters or years. And then at the end, we're going to leave lots of time for questions, especially around market data coverage and how some of what we talked about today compares to legacy providers.
Before we jump into all of that, I want to briefly share a bit of context about Barchart, the organization behind today's discussion. So Barchart was founded over 30 years ago with its roots in the Chicago commodity markets. In fact, Barchart was the first company to bring futures price data to the internet in 1996. Fast forward to today, Barchart provides the data and infrastructure that powers trading, investment, risk management, and analytics workflows, particularly in the futures and options space, although multi-asset class, there's a speciality there. But that's where data quality and reliability are really critical. Everything we'll discuss today reflects that history, the deep market expertise, the institutional grade data, and a focus on helping firms make smarter decisions with confidence, which is where Barchart tries to root itself.
Yeah, that's good, Mark. Thanks for that reminder. And with that in mind, let's start to share what we've learned about how market data delivery has evolved and how firms are now standing up this full exchange data environments in days instead of months. I think a good place to start is right at the beginning. Let's start with how we got here.
Yeah, what's striking is that most teams don't start out trying to replace their infrastructure. They start out trying to solve one problem. It could be coverage gaps, slow backfills, complex audit requests. And suddenly they're maintaining something that looks an awful lot like a full-scale, albeit cobbled together, data platform. Our goal today is simple. By the end of the webinar, you'll have a clear framework to decide when building still makes sense and when buying an enterprise-grade solution can get you to production faster and with less risk.
Well, before we go any further, Mark, let's make this webinar broadcast more interactive. So right now, everybody on your screen, you're going to see a quick poll, a live poll launch, and we're going to ask you this question. We'll put it on the screen. What would generate the highest return on your time this year? Is it going to be faster research cycles, cleaner governance and audit readiness, scaling infrastructure without necessarily hiring more engineers, accelerating maybe your software sales if you're in more a financial analytics business, or reducing your engineering overhead? We can launch that poll and get your feedback right now. So you can see there's some radio buttons on the screen there. You can actually interact with it and select the one that resonates with you the most. And while you're voting, I want you to notice something important. None of these are about building market data plumbing. They're really about outcomes: speed, confidence, scale, revenue, efficiency. That's kind of the common threads here. And we're going to take about 10 more seconds, and then we'll close the poll and share back what you selected. That'll be interesting to see. So we'll close it down in 3, 2, 1. All right, thanks for your feedback. Let's see what the results say, Mark Water.
Yeah, it looks like faster research cycles. It's speed. Speed wins always, right?
Speed wins by a long shot in this case, doesn't it? That's really interesting feedback, everybody. Thank you so much for that.
All right, so yeah, I mean, at one point, every firm is going to end up visiting this question. Should you buy or should you build your market data infrastructure? Build gives you control, autonomy. Buy gives you a quick implementation. You're going to market. And for a long time, especially with APIs, building was always the right answer. The challenge is what works when monitoring 50 different symbols tends to break when you're dealing with orders of magnitude, and then you have 50,000 symbols and beyond. So what we're seeing now is that many teams aren't actively choosing to build. They just simply inherited a legacy tech stack that has just been piled on and has grown over time.
That's right, Mark. And for a long time, I think the build versus buy equation, it kind of felt relatively stable. And that's because APIs provided control. The internal builds provided flexibility. And then for many firms that worked, but we're feeling like and noticing in the research that it's changed. And it's not because APIs stopped functioning. They still are relevant and purpose-built. But even though they're highly relevant, we can't also say that there's a problem with internal teams, that they've lacked capabilities. That's not what we're finding either. What we're finding is that it's changed because of three structural shifts, and they've all occurred simultaneously. The first shift was really about coverage. The universe of instruments in terms of market data has exploded. It's no longer just futures or equities, it's option series, it's global venues, it's cross asset strategies. So what used to be kind of a contained symbol universe is now dynamic, it's expanding, it's constantly evolving. Even as we're on this webinar, people are having to shift to different parts of the world to respond to risk or hedging. The second shift was organizational. Market data is no longer just for quants. It's required by teams in risk and compliance and treasury and client reporting. So when each team accesses or ingests this market data independently, what we found is that duplicate pipelines emerge. And duplicate pipelines actually create fragmentation. What I mean is there's different timestamps that everyone's referencing, or different symbol mappings, or, God forbid, different versions of the truth. Now, the third shift was really about governance. This means auditability, data lineage, meaning can you reproduce where that data came from and why it said what it said. These are no longer just best practices anymore. They're really core requirements. That means internally stitched systems, especially those that were built up over time. Now they're kind of struggling to find a single source of truth. And once data governance, meaning data policies, roles, standards for accuracy, becomes more mandatory rather than just optional, the tolerance for any kind of fragility in data architecture, it's evaporated. So individually, none of these shifts break your data architecture, but together they fundamentally change the build versus buy equation that we've been talking about for well past a decade, maybe two now. And that's where we begin to see three common traps that we're going to discuss in a moment.
At a certain scale, we started seeing the same failure patterns over and over and over again, ad infinitum, really. Symbol by symbol gesture became a big problem. It impacts the speed aspect of it. And again, the response time and rate limits for making slow backfills. Once again, hitting that speed issue that everyone seemed to take umbrance with earlier. There's metadata drift across teams. There's difficulty spinning up multi-asset back tests. And then there's multiple sources of truth for the same market. Nothing breaks catastrophically, but everything gets slower. It gets harder to govern. It's less agile, and it introduces just an additional point of failure every time you build on top of that legacy architecture.
That's right, Mark. So let's ground this conversation in our research findings. The first finding that we want to share with you today is that robust market data infrastructure is no longer a competitive advantage by itself. Hear me in the right way on this. What we mean is that it's table stakes. So in other words, it's expected. It's a baseline for participation in a dynamic market. So what differentiates firms today is what they built on top of that infrastructure, not the plumbing itself. Here's our second finding from our research. 48% of technology project failures, especially in the face of, say, AI fatigue, can be traced back to three common traps. And we want to talk about those today. But I want to let you know up front, it's not about bad intentions. It's not about lack of talent on your team, but it's more of like a structural miscalculation. What I mean is underestimating maybe the hidden costs going into building something, and then overestimating the need for controlling everything. And then what ends up happening is kind of an absorption of ongoing maintenance costs. So that kind of drags you down, doesn't it? These traps don't usually cause a dramatic collapse. It's more like a gradual erosion of speed, of clarity, of capital efficiency. And when infrastructure is table stakes, like we're asserting today, but your architecture is kind of eating up more than its fair share of your team's energy, that's what we believe causes the build versus buy question to become unavoidable.
Yeah, so we kind of set the table for this. So let's take a closer look at what these three traps really are. And we're going to start with the first one. We call it the iceberg. On the surface, infrastructure decisions often look really manageable, if you will. They see the initial development costs, the sprint timelines, engineering roadmap. That's the visible layer, the code, everything feels contained. It's nice and neat. But what research consistently shows is that the visible cost is only a fraction of what the total cost is. For every $1 spent on that initial development, you have 5 to 10 additional dollars are spent on the actual plumbing behind it. And what is that plumbing? It's your data pipelines, your security layers, your compliance frameworks, your normalization logic, your version control, monitoring and observability. That's all the plumbing of it, everything under the surface that you're not seeing. So this initial development cost sits above the waterline, but the infrastructure burden, the part that compounds it, that lives below. It's hidden from you. This is the treacherous ice because it's not visible in those early budget discussions. It's not taken into account. Yet it determines whether the system scales smoothly or becomes a long-term drag on capital and engineering time. When firms underestimate this multiplier, they don't fail immediately. They accumulate complexity. And over time, that complexity becomes structural and, of course, difficult to unwind.
So that's the first of our 3 common traps. The second common trap is what we call the mirage. It's the one on the horizon. It's how full control kind of looks empowering, meaning firms aim to take control of their destiny by programming their own exchange data infrastructure. And the thinking often sounds a little bit like this. I mean, it's manageable. It's just code, right? Yeah, early on, it definitely feels that way. You build ingestion, you normalize symbols, you wire up the internal systems, but then the firm goes live with said application or infrastructure, and that promise of control, it begins to shift a little bit. Because, I mean, control doesn't mean writing code, does it? Anyone these days can vibe code with ChatGPT or Claude Code or Cursor or Gemini or what have you. But there's really more to it. It's maintaining the code long-term. It means adapting it. It means updating it every time any kind of financial exchange adds a new listing. It means patching schemas together when they evolve. It means monitoring it continuously. And then slowly something changes. Time that was meant for generating alpha at your firm, time that was meant for research, let's say, time that was meant for developing new models, it gets redirected into that plumbing. So instead of exchange data feeding itself, the plumbing begins feeding itself cost-wise, right? That's the mirage. The full control looks like strategic leverage, but then at scale, it starts to become more about the maintenance overhead, and that maintenance overhead rarely shows up, like you said, Mark Water, on that original build plan. And when that overhead keeps compounding year after year after year, it kind of leads directly to the third trap.
Yep, and that's the one we call the hidden tax, which leads us to a larger question. Is that binary build versus buy question even pertinent in 2026? What we often see, though, is that firms aim to take full control of their destiny by building the infrastructure. And once again, the internal narrative, internally, we all talk about it, sounds very familiar. It's manageable, it's just code, we deploy it all the time, got it. But here's what research consistently confirms. Annual maintenance costs typically run between 30 to 40% of the original development spend. And that's not a one-time expense, that's a recurring expense. It's a yearly cost that you have to live with going forward. And when you combine that with the 5x to 10x plumbing multiplier discussed earlier, you'll start to see the full picture, and development is the visible line item. The underlying plumbing becomes the compounding cost. And then when you start look at this strategic build decision, it quietly becomes this structural task on your engineering bandwidth also. The most important part is that tax doesn't show up in that ROI calculation you did earlier. It shows up later. Slower research cycles, deferred innovation, governance friction. So the real issue isn't simply build versus buy. It's whether the infrastructure you own is generating leverage or absorbing it, from other parts of the organization. And that's why we need to, have a different lens to disarm these traps.
Mark, you outlined that third common trap perfectly. Let's take a second to recap, because we did talk about 3 common traps. We've talked about hidden costs. We've talked about maintenance drag. We've talked about labeling these as like the iceberg, the mirage, the hidden tax. But here's the most important question you might want to ask yourself. What could you accomplish if you redirected many of those infrastructure costs and avoided these 3 common implementation traps that we just talked about? For example, what if your engineering team's time wasn't absorbed by stitching together pipelines? What if governance didn't require a lot of different reconciliation processes just because all the systems aren't talking to each other? What if spinning up new back tests, if this applies to you, didn't mean restarting a whole new project and ingestion cycle? I mean, what would that unlock? In other words, faster research cycles, more experimentation, cleaner audit readiness? Would it be about, if you're in financial analytics, shorter enterprise software sales? And that leads us to really a key takeaway. By building the alpha while buying the plumbing, it seems research shows that teams reduce operational risk and they're able to deploy strategies in days, not weeks or months. Now, that's not a tooling upgrade. That's a structural shift in this metric we would call time to value. And that shift, that same shift, it compounds over time. So how do you know if you've reached one of those inflection points?
We'd like to close the loop with one final question. We'll bring back up our, interactive live poll that we used earlier. And we're going to ask you, which of these friction signals resonates with you the most? Is it speed, where backtests take longer to set up than they do to actually run? Is it confidence, where answering data lineage questions leads to your drawn out email chains instead of immediate clarity? Is it fragmentation, where multiple official data sources, if you will, exist between the risk and the research teams? Is it complexity, where cross-asset strategies are treated as special projects rather than standard workflows? Is it sprawl, where multi-vendor sprawl has quietly complicated all of your data pipelines? So let's pop this up here. We can take a moment and select the one that feels most familiar to you. As you vote, note that each of these signals are pointing to that same underlying issue. If the time sink, it's going to eat it. Complexity that compounds simple workflows is the problem. And none of this is solved by writing more plumbing, by putting another layer on top. So let's take a few more seconds for the responses. Personally, I think we're going to end up with speed again. Like I said, speed always wins. So that's my guess here.
That's your vote, Mark.
Yeah.
Should we close it down and share back the results?
Yeah, let's take a look at the results here. Oh, it looks like we're a little tighter than last time. Wait, segmented data sources seems to be the winner. All right, so it looks like I was wrong. But no, that does tell a story. It's a simple problem that we see. You can't stitch it together as easy as most people think you could. But yeah, thank you. So this tells us where the pressure is being felt. And in most organizations, once again, Matt said, it's not a lack of talent, it's a structural constraint. And the structural constraints surface repeatedly across speed, governance, fragmentation, and scale. That's usually a signal that the architecture, not the team, needs to evolve. And that's where the assemble approach starts to become most relevant.
First, we do want to thank you for participating in the live polls that we did today. Your feedback actually helps us tremendously understand where the real pressure points are for you and your teams. So we'd like to say thank you, and a way to do that is to leave you with something practical, we feel. So we're going to offer our 5-signal diagnostic toolkit as a gift. This is just a downloadable PDF. It's designed to help you very quickly assess your own time to value, and it's based on your industry. This is not a marketing brochure. It really is just a structured framework. It's a way for you to kind of evaluate your current ingestion model, your governance posture, how much your infrastructure that you have today can scale. We've kind of divided it into 5 different industries: hedge funds, asset managers, banks, algo trading firms, fintech analytic providers. So this is going to allow you to very quickly look at your environment and kind of rate it across 3 different dimensions: speed, risk, and scale. And the goal is very simple with this PDF. It's just to help you objectively assess where you are in that build versus buy equation we've been talking about today. So this will help you think much more clearly. Whether you move forward with Barchart or not, that's not the point, because the real objective isn't selling infrastructure. It's helping you improve that time to value ratio. So stick around to the end of the webinar, and then we'll explain how to get your own copy of this 5-signal diagnostic to use for yourself. So stay tuned for that.
What actually happens when institutions remove unnecessary complexity? What happens when you diffuse those 3 common traps we talked about earlier today? When the plumbing below the surface is simplified, the gains are measurable. First, fragmented pipelines are consolidated. No more multiple ingestion paths fighting for authority, no more duplicated efforts. Second, backtests are launched in days, not months. Researchers spend their time modeling, not scraping and cobbling together a data set to be able to run it. Third, audit requests are fulfilled the same exact day because governance and lineage are structured at the foundation. They're not layered on afterwards. It's a secondary thought that came up later in a process. And what changes then beneath all that surface? The market data plumbing, the part that quietly consumes maintenance cycles, attention, all of that is streamlined. Developers are redeployed from monitoring and repairing infrastructure to modeling strategy and innovation initiatives, if you will. Data governance policies are enforced once from top to bottom, rather than per system or per team or per exception. The result, it isn't just technical efficiency at that point, it's organizational leverage. When complexity is reduced at the foundation, speed increases everywhere else. And that's why the assemble approach has become the dominant model from what we see.
Yeah, Mark, and at this point in the conversation, it's getting much clearer. The most effective institutions aren't choosing between build or buy. They're actually assembling. Think about it like a hybrid approach. They're being intentional about what they build and very, very disciplined about what they buy. So let's break that down. When it comes to building, the focus should be here: strategy, proprietary algorithms, unique differentiator, key analytics. This is where the competitive advantage lies. This is where the intellectual property lives, and this is where return on innovation lives as well. So building in these areas, it actually creates leverage. But now let's look at what belongs on the buy side. You have connectivity, cleaning, normalization, storage, data sovereignty. These are foundational capabilities, and of course they're essential, but they're not differentiators by themselves. But when firms are building this plumbing internally, they're absorbing all that ongoing maintenance overhead. But when they buy it, they can standardize it and stuff it down into fixed cost. So that's the shift: building the edge and buying the foundation. That's the hybrid solution that we found works very well based on our research and our own observations. That's the assemble approach. The firms that scale most effectively, we found in 2026, are not the ones building everything. They're the ones building the right things. So let's take a look at a quick case example of how this could play out.
Yeah, let's make this a real example for us. This comes from a global client of ours, and their challenge is what we call the backtest bottleneck. They were assembling multi-asset data, so both equities and futures via an API. And every time they wanted to introduce a new market, the cycle restarted. Symbol master files recreated, data pulls, normalization, validation. What should be just a simple research initiative became a data assembly project. And in many cases, it took 2 weeks just to prepare the data before a backtest could even begin. They made a structural change. They moved to a standardized full exchange file drop daily system to power what could become a backtest engine. Instead of pulling by symbol, they just ingested the complete exchange. The end result was speed. Researchers could launch backtests the same day, and resources could be allocated elsewhere. Developers were redeployed from plumbing to modeling. The infrastructure layers stopped being the bottleneck, and research cycles became accelerated. And that's the difference between building the plumbing and buying it.
Next, let's talk about how firms are deploying enterprise-grade market data in days instead of months, quarters, or years. So let's bring this all together. Today, we're pleased to introduce to you Market Replay Enterprise. This is how firms are actually deploying enterprise-grade market data in days instead of months or years. The model is intentionally simple. No stitching. It's just clean, consistent files ready for direct ingestion. No discovery layers. It's a complete universe delivered. Instead of pulling symbols one by one, in other words, you receive standardized full exchange datasets in bulk. And it's delivered securely over SFTP, or if you're familiar with this, AWS S3, and it can be provisioned in under a week. So this is not about replacing everything. This is about stabilizing the foundation. The shift is really straightforward. It goes from pulling symbols to ingesting markets. And when you ingest markets instead of chasing symbols, backfills accelerate, governance simplifies, and that time to value metric we've been talking about is so important. Well, that compresses. So that's a structural change. Market Replay Enterprise isn't the alpha per se, but it is the backbone for it.
For us, Market Replay Enterprise was built around 5 core pillars from day one. These aren't feature add-ons. They were structural commitments we made during the design phase of this. The first of those is scalability. It's market breadth first, complete coverage of futures, equities, options, Forex, cryptocurrency, cash, proprietary, fundamental data, everything within the universe without engineering friction. This isn't symbol by symbol expansion. It's a full universe of coverage delivered consistently. Second was reliability. Predictable and replicable delivery schedules, the kind you can set a watch to, no guesswork, no rate throttling, no dependency on request volumes. Third, security. Data sovereignty is preserved, delivered via secure RSA key authentication to SFTP or directly to an S3 bucket. You control the environment and you control the ingestion. The fourth is integration. Data formatted specifically for direct ingestion into data lakes and data warehouses, AWS, Snowflake, Databricks, whatever you're using. This isn't a raw feed delivery. It's ingestion-ready structure. The fifth is governance, a single source of truth across the organization, one structure, one schema, one validation process. Governance is enforced once, not per system, not per team, not per source. It's there at the base level. When these 5 pillars are stable, the rest of the data stack can move much faster.
That's right, Mark. Now let's talk about coverage, because coverage expansion is often where infrastructure strain begins. That's what we've been talking about on this broadcast today. Market Replay Enterprise is actually designed to eliminate that strain. So first, Mark, you mentioned it earlier, it's cross-asset. That means futures, equities, options, indices, and much, much more. And that's all delivered in a unified structure. So when your strategy expands across asset classes, your ingestion model doesn't actually need to. The second thing is about multi-frequency. On this Market Replay Enterprise platform, it's delivering end-of-day, intraday, deep historical data. So as your sort of research cycles accelerate or AI models demand much richer data, you don't have to re-architect your pipelines. Third, it includes our proprietary and hard-to-find data sets. Mark, you mentioned earlier Barchart's proprietary cash grain bids that surveys, let's say, 4,000 grain elevators in North America. Or it could be implied volatility indices rolled up by commodities, so you get a sense of what the market's doing. Or agricultural yield data that has overlaid satellite imagery, including moisture and heat. So this could also be, I mentioned hard to source data. What would that be like? Well, London Metal Exchange multi-venue pricing. What I mean by that is telling you exactly what's happening on the open outcry pit or the telephone trading or electronic trading for major metals. So these are the data sets that typically force teams to bolt on yet another pipeline, another vendor, another ingestion workflow. The goal with all this is very simple. It's to reduce the need for clients to expand their plumbing ever again. So as your strategy grows, as regulatory requirements evolve, and we know they will, as your data appetite increases, the foundation remains stable. So what we're saying is scale your strategy, not the plumbing, and hopefully Barchart can take care of that part. Earlier, I mentioned a downloadable PDF, a diagnostic tool to help you assess your own time to value for any market data initiatives that you might have. And it's based on your industry. We can send this to you after the webinar. One way you can let us know that you like it is go ahead and just use the GoToWebinar control panel chat box and type in the word 5. Right now you can do that, and that way our team will just have a note to send it to you. Just type FIVE into the chat right now, and then that just logs it that you've requested it, and we will send you that PDF and follow up after the webinar.
So if this resonates with you, the next step is a short working session to map our current pipelines to a Market Replay Enterprise deployment. And with that, let's open this up for some Q&A, quick questions here.
All right, so Mark, I think the first question that we're getting here is how have we seen the build versus buy shift over time?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So I can go back to it, well, as long as I've been in the industry. So I'll go back to 2008, because going into 2008, it was a buy environment in terms of technology, whether it was hardware, whether it was network components, everything was built on this buy mentality because that's how you would get the edge, that infrastructure edge you're talking about. But then you had 2008 happen and everything kind of, you know, became a little bit more difficult, and they realized that that buy concept was actually operational risk. So what you saw was just a massive shift very quickly to a build setup. And that lined up though right with things coming online that allowed you to scale rapidly. So there was the build setup, and then you have a cloud infrastructure come into place. You're no longer having to buy hardware to maintain on-prem data centers, so on and so forth. It seems like the right idea. You build, you build, you build, except as the availability of all of that storage became more prevalent and scalability became infinite, you all of a sudden had much larger data centers, much larger data stacks to actually go after. And you're bringing in inputs then from things outside of price data. And that build infrastructure now is overly complex. The technology moved faster than people wanted to rebuild the infrastructure. So then you kind of went back into another cycle of, okay, now we are going to go back to buy, because now someone can do it better than us because they've come out in the last 3 to 5 years and we're sitting on something that's 10 years old and doesn't make sense anymore. So we've kind of gone into these circles, and now you have things like blockchain, and you have things that are accelerating the data again. You have AI requiring massively large data sets, and we have these legacy systems that are all built. Now they're scaling back to buy. Maybe the internal governance is now buy instead of build. It's just a constant shift in focus over time. I think, you know, maybe what we're discussing here today is trying to break that back and forth dichotomy of it and move to a pure, you know, setup that would allow us to utilize the best of both worlds and actually build where is necessary, but buy the technology that would allow you to build more efficiently.
Yeah, Mark, that's a good point. Is what we're trying to do is assert some way to be more future-proof instead of constantly chasing around, or maybe a better metaphor is whack-a-mole. Remember that some people know that it's, you know, where you're just kind of hitting the circus game to try to keep up. Here's another question, Mark, that came in. It's from Julius. I think it's really good because it addresses more than Market Replay Enterprise that we talked about today. But see if you can answer this. Does Market Replay Enterprise also support streaming for like delayed data or real-time data? How would you answer that?
Yeah, so when we actually looked at building it, it was part of a complete solution, if you will. So we were looking to have something that would be a very powerful architecture that could backfill and maintain internal data sources, but then at the same time seamlessly integrate with different delivery mechanisms we have it off of a single schema. So things like a streaming data feed, whether it's, you know, level 1, level 2, last sale price, even streaming minute bars, can sit on that same architecture in the same schema, in the same format as Market Replay Enterprise. And the actual databases that are powering, you know, the internal file systems, like there's an intraday file structure that can be delivered in a delayed format through Market Replay Enterprise that's actually built off the streaming feed. So the idea is that if you run these all side by side, you have a single set of timestamps, you have a single source of truth. That data governance model is actually persistent across all the different delivery mechanisms. So it's not really siloed off, but rather part of the whole when it comes to that comprehensive data delivery solution that we have.
Yeah, that's good. There's one more question here, Mark. I think what we'll do right now is, so for anybody who still has questions, go ahead and post them to GoToWebinar question box in your control panel. Mark, let's take one more question. We'll kind of start to wrap up, and then you and I can hang out and answer even more questions if that's still needed. So Mark, one thing that came up, a question that came in here is about historical data. So Market Replay Enterprise, there's kind of a dividing line, but we bundle them together. One is daily collection, right? How do I sort of monitor markets today and price and volatility and all that good stuff? But then there's a historical piece. So are both pieces, daily price collection and historical pieces, are those included in Market Replay Enterprise, or that's something totally separate?
So the historical data is underpinning and behind the daily collection. The idea is as you go into Market Replay Enterprise, you could actually strip out the history and then build on top of it if you want to maintain your own database. They can be licensed independently. You don't have to take the history to take the ongoing, but the goal was So you have it be much quicker and easier to onboard rather than trying to do like a large one-time data transfer in and of itself or strip something out via API and then build on top of it going forward. So it really was just a speed to deployment decision that would allow someone to just bring down all the data at once in a similar schema and then just build on top of it going forward. Realistically, people start ingesting the daily file, and then after a couple of days of determining the schema, they just pull out the historical, so there's a slight overlap, but it makes everything run really smoothly.
That's right. So the major takeaway there is history versus daily collection. It doesn't have to slow down operations. All right, let's pause on questions for now. Those are great questions. Thanks for contributing, everybody. We do hope that you found this webinar helpful so far. Mark, let's talk about next steps. After all, any good meeting worth its salt is gonna end with clear and simple actions, right?
Yeah, that's right, Matt. After attending the webinar, where do we go from here? Well, we have 3 simple next steps, if you will. First is review. Run that 5-signal diagnostic on your current ingestion and delivery models. Look honestly at your speed, your governance, your posture, fragmentation, scalability. And the goal is not to criticize the architecture, it's to quantify what your time to value is. The second, schedule something with us. Reach out to us to schedule a working session. This isn't a demo. It's also really hard to demo a data delivery mechanism, but either way, it's a dynamic discussion. We're going to examine your current stack and determine whether Market Replay Enterprise could actually measurably improve your time to value metrics. And then the third is define. During that working session, we're going to help you define your specific coverage, the scalability, the governance requirements. This is going to include things like cross-asset needs, multi-frequency needs, security requirements, and whatever your ingestion environment is. So the conversation stays grounded in your architecture and what you're looking to do, not a generic solution that we're hammering into whatever you've built over time. And finally, we invite you to download the executive report, the AI Iceberg, where the boring plumbing determines AI success. You can access it via slide handouts inside GoToWebinar or email us after the session. We'll send it over to you. And if you'd like to connect directly with us, you can just email solutions@barchart.com. We'll be able to get back to you really quickly there. Well, brings us to the end of this though. So, the objective is not to replace what works for you guys. It's to ensure that your foundation accelerates your strategy. Build the edge, buy the plumbing. With that, let's close out the webinar. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll hang out for a few more moments to answer any questions you have additionally in the GoToWebinar chat. But at this point, our mics will be muted. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.